aren't new. However, our senior military leaders have consistently advised against such courses of action, and the past 2 administrations have rejected them as well. They should be rejected again. As most in this chamber know, our nuclear forces have aged far beyond their designed lifetime. After delaying and deferring the modernization of our nuclear forces for decades, we are now at an inflection point. As Admiral Richard, the current STRATCOM commander, testified last year, quote, "Many of the modernization and sustainment efforts necessary to ensure the deterrence viability have zero schedule margin and are late to need," end quote. His point is clear. Further delay will result in capabilities aging out, with no replacements available. Our nuclear deterrent would literally wither on the vine. This would have a number of disastrous consequences for our security at a time when nuclear threats are growing, and it would also dramatically undermine future diplomatic efforts to negotiate limits with Russia and China on their arsenals. After all, why would either nation agree to new rounds of arms reductions if they knew that the United States was cutting its forces anyway, regardless of whether they agreed to do likewise? We must keep this in mind when we hear calls to dismantle the triad or cancel our modernization programs. Doing so would make our country less safe by cutting the forces needed to deter aggression, and it would make the world less safe by ensuring that the United States is never in a position again to push for real reductions to Russian and Chinese nuclear forces. Instead of reducing incentives for Russia and China to negotiate, Congress and the administration should work together to strengthen them and set the conditions for successful diplomatic efforts in the future. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. I would suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Madam President, are we in a quorum call?
We are.
Madam President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Madam President, today I rise in support of my friend and fellow Minnesotan, Dennis McDonough, as President Biden's nominee for Secretary of Veterans Affairs. And no one knows but you, the Senator from Illinois, Madam President, about how important this job is for our veterans. Dennis grew up in Stillwater, Minnesota, which is right near the Wisconsin border. He is the grandson of Irish immigrants, the son of devout Catholic parents, and brother to 10 siblings. He attended St. John's College in Collegeville, Minnesota, and in addition to graduating summa cum laude, he played safety on the very proud championship St. John's football team. I've been privileged to call Dennis a friend for years, and I know he will serve our country well as the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. As he has done his whole life, he will honor the promises that our country has made to our veterans and their families. Dennis's commitment to our nation's veterans was clear during his time as President Obama's Chief of Staff, where he made sure that every decision impacting our service members, veterans, and their families was befitting of their sacrifices. Showing respect and gratitude for our nation's veterans is not something Dennis just prioritizes, it's a value for him. As we know from his time as President Obama's Chief of Staff, he is an adept manager who understands how to tackle complex challenges throughout our government, which will be vital for the next secretary. As we also know, the VA is facing a number of challenges, from helping veterans to stay safe during the pandemic to improving the quality of care for veterans around the country. These are not simple problems, and these are not simple challenges, and they will require, as you have shown, Madam President, true leadership and vision, which have been, again, the hallmark of Dennis's time in public service. I also know that he will work tirelessly to find bipartisan solutions, and I think you see that from the support that he has gotten throughout the country, as well as on the Veterans Affairs Committee, where I was honored to introduce him when he started on this journey of Senate approval. And it has never been more important than ever to unite our country and get that kind of support. So much of our work with our veterans is about keeping our promises and showing respect, not just in words, but in action. When other senators who don't know Dennis as well or are new to Washington, what they may see as time goes on, you will see the qualities of honor and loyalty in Dennis's commitment to his family, which also includes his family in Minnesota. So I know this firsthand. He has so many relatives that you can't go anywhere without running into some McDonough. You see it in how he has treated everyone he's worked with. When he worked in the Senate, when he worked as President Obama's Chief of Staff. And I also will assure my fellow senators that he will listen to senators. He will have respect to the people that work here. You see it every day in how he always puts his country first. During his distinguished career, Dennis has approached each and every job with the spirit of respect, honesty, and collaboration, and a willingness to make himself accessible to his colleagues and his team. He is deeply committed to supporting the workforce at the VA, and I want our veterans to know he will do two things so well. He will listen, and he will get things done for you. One of my favorite stories about Dennis involves this: listening and then getting things done. We were having a lot of trouble up in northern Minnesota with the iron ore mines closing down, as you all remember, kind of coming out of the downturn. It never really bounced back, and then we had the steel dumping going on from China and other countries, the illegal steel dumping, and that really spread through the country and led to the closure of many of our mines. And we tried, we introduced legislation, and finally I asked Dennis to come up to northern Minnesota, since he was from our state, as President Obama's Chief of Staff, and sit down with a bunch of mayors from northern Minnesota, from Minnesota's Iron Range, with workers, with mine owners, and it was this long, long table, and nearly everyone had spoken. And near the end, a miner named Dan Hill, he was the last to go, and he said, well, everything's been said, so I'll just tell the story. And he said that he was out of work, and he said that his son had just graduated from preschool. And the teacher asked him at the graduation, what do you want to do when you grow up? And kids were saying all kinds of things, that they wanted to play basketball, or they were going to fly an airplane, and all kinds of cool things. And Dennis's son looked at the teacher and he said, I want to be a miner like my daddy. And at that moment, Dan Hill took this steelworker T-shirt that he had in his hands, and he threw it across the whole long table. And I remember sitting next to Dennis thinking, you were a football player, catch the T-shirt. And he caught the T-shirt. And Dan Hill says, Mr. McDonough, make it come true, make it come true. So Dennis listened, but then he acted. He went back to Washington, and he didn't just ignite a fire under the Commerce Department to get them to do even more work than they were already doing on enforcing tariffs and going after this illegal dumping and bringing things to the International Trade Commission, but he also looked at other agencies, and he helped us, along with Sherrod Brown and so many others, to pass legislation that made a difference. And all of this happened, and Dan Hill got his job back. And then I invited Dan Hill to come to one of the last State of the Unions for President Obama. And Dennis invited Dan Hill to the White House, and Dan Hill got to practically meet everyone surrounding the president. That is Dennis McDonough. He listened, but he didn't just say, oh, I got there, I went, we'll try our best. He actually followed through the minutia of government to get things done. I'm going to end with the words of a poet who President Biden happens to love. And given Dennis's Irish roots, I can't think of a better person to quote from today's vote. And it was Mr. Haney, who once wrote, anyone with gumption and a sharp mind will take the measure of two things, what's said and what's done. So Dennis will not just say words to the veterans of this country as your secretary, he will get things done. With that, Madam President, I ask my colleagues to support the nomination Dennis McDonough as Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Thank you, and I yield the floor. Absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
President.
Senator from South Dakota. Oops, Texas.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, it's been more than a month since a violent mob stormed this building and attempted to disrupt the congressional certification of presidential electors, the vote of those electors. Rather than a peaceful transition of power, some of the mob turned their grievances into violent action. But again, that's the problem with mobs. No matter what the intentions were of those who were simply exercising their rights to free speech and free assembly, mobs invariably degenerate into the lowest common denominator. That element of the mob assaulted police officers, destroyed property, and trespassed in the halls of the United States Capitol. Some roamed these halls in search of members of Congress against whom they actually threatened harm. And if not for the heroism of the men and women of the Capitol Police, the human cost would have likely been higher. The criminal acts of the mob were disgraceful and indefensible. Regardless of party or politics, there should be no disagreement on that most basic point. The people making up this mob came to Washington with the idea that the results of the 2020 election were not final. President Trump fed that fantasy by repeatedly claiming the election was stolen, even after he had exhausted all of his legal remedies in dozens and dozens of lawsuits. The president's actions were reckless. He should have known better than to stoke a flame he could not and did not control. But the events of January the 6th are only part of the story, and it is the congressional response, including impeachment, that I now want to talk about. Simply put, the snap impeachment raises serious questions about fundamental fairness, due process, or more accurately, a lack thereof. Unlike previous impeachments, there was no formal inquiry, no investigation, no hearings, no witnesses, no cross-examination, no nothing. We know impeachment is not like a traditional judicial proceeding. It's not a court of law, but it does make common sense, and I think this was the direction we gave the House during the last impeachment trial, that it's the House's obligation to investigate, develop the evidence, and then charge, not the other way around. Historically, this has been true for impeachment proceedings. Each time the House has conducted a full-scale investigation before a vote on the articles of impeachment. As I said, that was the case last year when the House spent months deposing witnesses, holding hearings, building a case against the president before ever announcing formal charges. But this time around, they took an entirely different approach. In attempting to justify this unprecedented departure from a fair and dignified proceeding, some of our Democratic friends claim that no evidence needs to be presented, saying that we were all witnesses to what happened on January the 6th, and that we can be jurors, witnesses, and in the words of at least one Democratic senator, victims, all at the same time. This week, President Trump's defense team will have the opportunity to present its case, and I expect a lack of due process to be a major area of focus, and rightfully so. Unfortunately, that's not the only problem with this impeachment trial. The Constitution requires the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court to preside over the impeachment trial of a president. But since this is the trial of a former president, a private citizen, someone who no longer holds office, Chief Justice Roberts will not be presiding. As a result, the senior senator from Vermont will now serve as both a judge and a juror, in addition to being a witness, I presume, and in the words of another senator, a victim. I respect Senator Leahy, but the fact of the matter is he cannot be an impartial arbiter. He has a conflict of interest. Following the House's impeachment vote, Senator Leahy called President Trump the greatest threat to the Constitution and to American democracy in a generation. He voted to convict Donald Trump during the last impeachment trial and apparently has already decided to do it again in this trial. The fact of the matter is no American, let alone a former president, should be tried before a juror who's already determined guilt or innocence and who also serves as a judge. I want to be abundantly clear, though, Madam President, on one point. President Trump's words and actions leading up to the attack were reckless and wrong. But as we all know, the constitutional standard for impeachment isn't recklessness. Treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, those are the offenses that the Constitution allows Congress to impeach and remove a president from office for violating or from committing, which brings us to one of the biggest concerns I have. Donald Trump is no longer president of the United States. He's a private citizen. Our Democratic colleagues moved so fast that they could impeach the president while he was in office, but failed to transmit the articles to the Senate until he became a private citizen. Legal experts have debated not only the constitutionality of trying a former president, but also the wisdom of doing so, and I share concerns on both those fronts. I think this ill-timed impeachment trial sets a dangerous precedent for future former presidents. As politicized as impeachment has become, it could become a reoccurring political exercise that would be toxic for our democracy. Prominent Democrats have warned about the dangers of using impeachment as a political weapon against an opposing party. During the impeachment inquiry of President Clinton, Senator Leahy himself counseled, a partisan impeachment cannot command the respect of the American people. It's no more valid than a stolen election. I agree with him. The problem with one party using impeachment to exact political retribution on an opposing party's president at the end of his term, or even after that president has left office, seems quite obvious to me. It's political retribution. Depending on which party controls Congress and which occupies the White House, this could turn into a regular blemish on our democracy. Rather than focusing together on our future in a new administration, seeking common ground and unity as President Biden has called for, such a precedent of trying a former president could create an endless feedback loop of recrimination. I think this is a dangerous and destructive path, and I would implore my colleagues on both sides to consider the long-term implications of this precedent. As Justice Story explained, the framers saw the Senate as a tribunal, in his words, removed from popular power and passions and from the more dangerous influence of mere party spirit, and was guided by deep responsibility to future times. So as before, Madam President, I don't take my role as a juror lightly, and I'll reserve final judgment until both the House impeachment managers and President Trump's defense team have had the opportunity to present their cases. But I do think, indeed I fear, we're skating on very thin ice and are in danger of inflicting great harm to our country by this rushed, unfair, and partisan proceeding. May God help us.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President. When President Biden addressed the nation on Inauguration Day, he promised unity and bipartisanship. It was a big part of his inaugural address, and so far, the Democrats here in Washington are not living up to that promise. Their message, and we saw this last week, is not unity, it is submit and conform. On his very first day in office, President Biden rubber-stamped 17 separate executive orders. Since then, he has approved so many changes that a lot of Tennesseans can barely keep track of the orders and memos and directives that are flying out of the Oval Office. It's safe to say the only benchmark they have to work with is the number of lost jobs we'll see as a result of all of this paper and pen governance and paperwork. Jobs gone, stroke of a pen. Madam President, the American people are very unsettled by this. I'm hearing it from Democrats, independents, Republicans, libertarians. Last week I came to the floor and I spoke in detail about how this lack of clarity about the future has made many Tennesseans fearful of the impending changes to our national security policy. They are very unsettled. So many of our veterans in Tennessee have talked with me about this. They don't like all this soft talk when it comes to talking about China and Russia and Iran and North Korea. They're worried about what comes next. The domestic policy mandates have done nothing at all to give reassurances or calm spirits. Last week, the Senate Democrats put forth a budget proposal that treats struggling communities like hypotheticals that could work with theoretical changes, all created for a graduate level economics exam. They're not dealing with real problems in real life. For about 15 hours, Madam President, we debated and voted on a fraction of the almost 900 amendments filed in an attempt to do some damage control to that budget resolution. But when Friday morning came and went, all the Democrats had to offer was a glaringly partisan resolution that blatantly contradicted President Biden's stated commitment to unity and bipartisanship. And you know what? In a perfect world, the solutions the Democrats have come up with just might work. But we do not live in a perfect world. We live in a fallen world. This country is not created in the image of the Democratic Party. To anyone who has ever managed a small business budget, what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are trying to do just does not make good common sense. One of the top issues I hear about from people back home in Tennessee is this proposal they have for a $15 an hour minimum wage. I feel I should remind my colleagues that resistance to this mandate doesn't come from a place of stinginess or classist hatred, but from a place of absolute confidence that it will destroy small businesses, even with the phase-in period. I have not heard from a single business owner who will be able to pay the wage and employ the same number of people. Not one. They'll have to let staff go. A report by the Congressional Budget Office released just today echoes and confirms their concerns. By 2025, the Democrats' proposal will cut jobs for 1.4 million workers. At a time, Madam President, when workers are struggling to get back to work. So much for job creation, and we all know the best economic stimulus is a job. Just 6 weeks ago, Congress passed a $900 billion COVID relief package. Very little of that money has been spent, and yet Democrats and the White House continue to demand trillions, that's right, trillions, in overbroad spending that targets no specific problem and has no actual bipartisan support. If that's not bad enough, billions of dollars from last year's bipartisan relief packages, all 5 of them, also remain unobligated. So we're $3.6 trillion in spending. And they're wanting another $1.9 trillion with little idea of the effect that remaining unobligated funding will have on the economy. But still, the data shows that what has been spent already has made a difference and will continue to do so. Relief should be timely. It should be targeted. It should be temporary. Those that need the help should get the help. But we do not need overbroad spending. The Congressional Budget Office released another report just over a week ago showing that if we leave the laws governing how we tax and spend alone, leave them alone on the books, in force, the GDP will continue to rise and the economy will get back to its pre-pandemic health without Congress authorizing one more penny in relief spending. So, the American people want to know why. Why are the Democrats claiming that the only solution to our present crisis is to spend as much as possible, as quickly as possible, without considering which sectors of the economy actually need the help, which families need help, which individuals need help? What we do know is what we saw in 2009 and 10 and 11 and 12 and 13 and 14 and 15 is that if you get in here and overspend without targeting, without direction, you slow the recovery. We know that. We watched it. We lived through it. They're going to need a better answer than because we say so, because this is what we're going to do, because the people understand that the federal deficit was historically large even before the pandemic. They know how debt works and that a big deficit means more of that federal debt. They also know that who holds that debt matters, and that we're beholden right now to China, to OPEC, for trillions of dollars in that debt. Scale that down for a minute. When that same thing happens to one of these small businesses, when they max their credit line, if they fall behind in their payroll, they can't plan for the future, they can't plan for emergencies, and they can't invest in their own success. The same concepts apply to the federal budget. You cannot tax and spend your way to prosperity. You have to have economic growth. So I ask my colleagues, why are you making decisions that are going to slow the recovery and slow the economic growth? The Democrats' approach to planning for the future might sound good in theory. It might sound good in hypotheticals, but real-life economics, it's not it. Future pandemics are not. The need to innovate and stay competitive in the war-fighting domain is not. Those are real-life issues. The Democrats have been so aggressive this past couple of weeks, and President Biden, in taking out the eraser and trying to erase 4 years of productive policy that benefited millions of Americans. And the people are starting to wonder what else they're going to throw away in favor of a very autocratic, authoritarian, empty vision for our nation. I yield the floor.
Senator from Montana.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have one request for a committee to meet during today's session of the Senate. It has approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent that before I'd be able to finish my remarks before the vote.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today in support of Dennis McDonough. Dennis is President Biden's choice to lead the Department of Veterans Affairs. Though there is a great political divide in our nation, I believe that veterans across the country and members on both sides of the aisle are united by a very basic expectation that the next VA Secretary be an individual of honesty, integrity, and vision. This individual must listen to veterans and put their well-being above all else. Dennis McDonough has demonstrated that he is unequivocally the man for this job. And to be clear, this is not an easy job. But Dennis is used to making tough calls. He has shown an exemplary commitment to public service and a strong willingness to do right by those who've worn the uniform and sacrificed on behalf of our liberties. As White House Chief of Staff, he quickly earned a reputation for getting the job done, working across federal agencies, and finding common ground. For the last 20 years, he's played a key role in many decisions surrounding sending our military men and women to war, and knows that taking care of these folks when they return home is a cost of war and a shared responsibility. Veterans need someone like Dennis fighting in their corner, but the truth is there is simply too much at stake. With more than 400,000 Americans dying from COVID-19 in less than a year, the VA Secretary's top responsibility will be ensuring that the department has everything it needs, from vaccines to personal protective equipment to additional health care and supportive services to care for veterans and protect the VA's employees. And he will be held accountable when it comes to swiftly implementing a number of historic reforms, from the John Scott Hannon's Veterans Mental Health Improvement Act, a bill that is out-of-box thinking to help our veterans and the mental health challenges and suicides that have resulted, to the Deborah Sampson Act, an act to help the largest or the fastest growing group of veterans, our women veterans, have access to care, to the expansion of presumptive coverage for thousands of additional Vietnam veterans exposed to Agent Orange, and overdue coverage for our Vietnam veterans. Not to mention a myriad of other critical priorities that have been in the works for years and need serious attention, such as the Caregivers Program and the Electronic Health Records Modernization effort. But Dennis is fully prepared to take on these responsibilities. He's ready to build the trust of our nation's service members, veterans, and their families, and treat them with the respect that they have earned. Now more than ever, veterans need a strong leader who will prioritize delivering timely and quality health care and benefits over making political points. I am confident that as VA Secretary, Dennis will be squarely focused on serving these needs. I ask my colleagues to join me today in confirming him to this role, where I have no doubt that he will be successful. Our nation's veterans are counting on us. Now, unfortunately, my friend and colleague, ranking member of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, Jerry Moran, couldn't make it back in time for this nomination due to bad weather and flight delays. But he was planning on voting to advance this nomination today because he believes Dennis McDonough is someone who shares his commitment to taking care of our veterans. I have Jerry's statement here. I would ask unanimous consent that it would be added to the record.
Without objection.
With that, Madam Chair, I yield and suggest the absence of a quorum. No?
The question is on the nomination.
Yes.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Carden, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Blackburn, Cantwell, Carper, Coons, Kramer, Crapo, Duckworth, Feinstein, Hassan, Leahy, Lummis, Murray, Peters, Reed, Sanders, Sinema, Smith, Tester, Whitehouse. Senators voting in the negative: Cotton, Hawley, Marshall. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan. Aye. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass. Aye. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Padilla. Aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono. Aye. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff. Aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins. Aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen. Aye. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds. Aye. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper. Aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith. Mrs. Hyde Smith. Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto. Aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Mr. King. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Ms. Ernst, no. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Cruz, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 87, the nays are 7. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Ohio.
President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to legislative session and be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today, Amazon workers in Alabama will begin receiving ballots that will give them, finally, a real voice in their workplace by choosing to join a union. Amazon would not be the massively successful company that it is. Jeff Bezos wouldn't be a multi-billionaire without the hard work and the dedication of its hundreds of thousands of U.S. workers. They put in long hours, they risked their own health during this pandemic to meet the increased demand that we all know. As of October, 20,000, think of this, 20,000 Amazon workers, 20,000 workers at one company, Amazon, had contracted COVID-19. That's as of October. We know those numbers would be much higher today. Because of their hard work, Amazon's profits have soared by more than 70%. The company's workers deserve to share in the success that they made possible. Amazon claims to recognize the value of its workers. They call their workers, quote, heroes fighting for their communities and helping people get critical items they need. Heroes, they called them. If the company truly believed and appreciated that they were heroes, Amazon might come back with might back up its words with action. That means letting these workers organize. It means stopping the corporate union-busting tactics that they've deployed against these workers. Amazon, one of the most powerful corporations in the world, unleashed all of that power to fight their own workers who are just asking for a voice on the job. They've harassed employees with propaganda, misleading text messages, websites, flyers. One Washington Post headline really said it all. Amazon's anti-union blitz stalks Alabama warehouse workers everywhere, even the bathroom. Workers have reported they don't get enough time for bathroom breaks in the warehouse. That's how intense the company's pressure is. When they're able to use the restroom, even there, workers are hit with anti-union propaganda flyers on the stall doors. Amazon has repeatedly tried to block mail-in voting and force workers to hold the union election in person, putting its workers, remember, 20,000 already been diagnosed back in October, putting its workers' health at even more risk just to suppress the vote. It's all part of a pattern for Amazon. In 2019, Amazon fired a Staten Island warehouse worker who called for unionization. They monitor employees' online communications. Last fall, we learned the company planned to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on new software to monitor, their words, threats like unions. It's little wonder Amazon is afraid of workers getting more power, so much of their business model is built on top of exploiting workers, often black and brown workers and women. Instead of employing many drivers directly, they use what they call Amazon Flex drivers. Just like with other gig economy jobs, Flex is corporate PR speak for denying workers their rights as full employees. They failed to provide complete data on COVID-19 spread in the workplace, so we really can't find out whether the company is protecting its workers' health. Amazon rolled back its tiny $2 per hour pandemic raise in June, and it announced a $2 an hour bonus pandemic raise with great fanfare many months ago. Then they rolled it back in June, and then they announced a one-time bonus of $300 per worker, not $3,000 per worker, $300 a worker, from a company that brought in $200 billion in revenue the previous year. $280 billion in revenue. They gave workers a bonus of $300. And Amazon's not alone. The Washington Post looked at the 50 biggest corporations and found that between April and September, these companies handed out more than $240 billion to their stockholders through stock buybacks and dividends. Companies like that are making more and more and more money. They're giving it back to executives and stockholders in huge dividends and stock buybacks, yet their workers are exposed to these health hazards at work, exposed to this virus. They come home always anxious and scared about infecting their families. The workers risk their own health, often at rock bottom wages, to make those companies so profitable. If even a global pandemic where America's workers have been on the front line, if even that will not get corporations to rethink their business model that treats workers as expendable, then we have to give workers more power in the job. A grocery store worker said, told me they say I'm essential, but really I feel expendable because they don't pay me much and they don't protect me in the job. So what do? It should mean collective bargaining. It should mean unions. It's why I joined Senator Murray and many of my colleagues last week to reintroduce the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, the PRO Act. It's a comprehensive overhaul of our labor laws, protect workers' right to stand together and bargain for fair wages, fair benefits, safer workplaces. We know corporations have attacked and undermined worker protections for decades, made it harder and harder for workers to even stand a chance at organizing a union when they choose to. And look what's happened to our economy. As corporations take away workers' power, productivity goes up, corporate profits soar, executive compensation explodes through the roof, but wages stay flat and the middle class shrinks. Just go over that again. Corporate profits, workers' productivity goes up. Workers are working harder and more efficiently. Productivity goes up, Corporate profits soar, executive compensation explodes, but wages stay flat and the middle class shrinks. Our bill would work to level the playing field, finally give workers a fighting chance against corporate union busting tactics like we see right now, today, last week, the week before, and today at Amazon. It would strengthen the punishment against companies that violate workers' rights to organize and the companies that retaliate against union organizers. It would restore fairness to an economy rigged against workers by closing loopholes that allow employers to misclassify their employees as supervisors and independent contractors so they don't have to live under labor law. We can't in this country, whether it's in Las Cruces or in Dayton, we can't have a strong growing middle class without strong unions. Union members earn 19% more on the average than similar workers in non-union jobs. They have better health care. They're better able to save for retirement. They have more predictable hours. Talk to Amazon workers about their hours. And they have more control over their schedules and more economic security. In a time when this pandemic reveals so much about inequality in our society, it's more vital than ever that we empower all workers. It's not a coincidence that so many of the workers at corporations like Amazon whom they exploit are workers of color. It's true at the Amazon Alabama facility. The retail, wholesale, and department store union organizing in Alabama has made respect and dignity central to its campaign. It comes back to the dignity of work. Remember what Dr. King said. He said, no job is menial unless you're not getting adequate wages. The president of the retail, wholesale, and department store union, Stuart Applebaum, said, we see this as much as a civil rights struggle as a labor struggle. We know where Dr. King was assassinated and what he was doing. He was fighting for civil rights. He was fighting for worker rights, fighting for sanitation workers in Memphis, some of the most exploited workers in America. A union card is a ticket to the middle class life. We fight for economic justice by making it available to all workers. We just need corporations just to get out of the way. Let workers organize. Let workers take control over their careers and their futures. When you love this country, Mr. President, you fight for the people who make it work, whether it's in New Mexico or Ohio or all over this country. That's what the Amazon workers in Alabama are doing. It's what unions have done throughout our history in this country. It's what we can do in the Senate by passing the PRO Act. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Florida.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Resolution 42 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 42, honoring the memories of the victims of the senseless attack at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School on February 14, 2018.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank my colleague, Senator Rubio, for joining me to introduce this resolution today, honoring the 17 victims of the senseless attack at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School on February 14, 2018. Alicia Aladif, Scott Beagle, Martin Duque Aguiano, Nicholas Duarte, Aaron Feist, Jimmy Guttenberg, Chris Hickson, Luke Hoyer, Carol Loren, Gina Maltato, Joaquin Olivar, Elena Petty, Meadow Pollock, Helena Ramsey, Alex Schachter, Carmen Schintrup, Peter Wang. I think of those innocent lives almost every day, lost too early in the tragic shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. These individuals were sons, daughters, parents, and partners. They were educators, athletes, musicians, many of them just kids with a life full of promise ahead of them. My heart breaks knowing they'll never get to pursue their dreams and that their families will always have a piece of their heart missing. Since that horrible day, I've worked closely with many of the victims' families to ensure no child, educator, or family has to experience that again. We passed the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School Public Safety Act while I was governor of Florida to make sure our state does everything in its power to prevent further tragedies. Now, as a U.S. Senator, I'm fighting for improvements on the federal level, including the Luke and Alex School Safety Act, named after Luke Hoyer and Alex Schachter, which builds on our work to keep schools safe. And while we can't bring back these lives lost that tragic day nearly 3 years ago, I'll always work to honor those lost and do everything in my power to protect our students and educators, ensure they have a safe environment to learn and succeed. Now I yield the floor to my colleague, Senator Rubio.
I thank my colleague from Florida. I recall vividly that day on February 14th, 2018, started like it does most days for people across the country. Take your children to school, drop them off, and in this case, some of them maybe drove themselves, and within hours, the lives of 17 families had been changed forever. It was a horrible tragedy. 17 students and faculty members who lost their lives, another 17 who were wounded in the attack, and it shocked the country. It was shocking because they went to do what so many people do on a regular basis in a place where you never think that something like that could happen. And as my colleague pointed out, there is no resolution in the Senate or words that we can say that will restore the lives that were lost or erase the pain still felt by those victims, their families, their friends, those who loved them. But even as we continue to grieve, we must also work to prevent something like this from happening anywhere at any time. I was proud that in the early days after this tragedy, within just a few weeks, that together, working across the aisle, we passed the Stop School Violence Act, which provided federal grant money for school safety, and that has been ongoing now for 3 years. We passed the Fix NICS Act, which helped patch some of the holes that existed in our background check system. Since that day, I've had the honor of getting to know and working with the parents of many of those who lost their lives at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. And I will say that their grace in the face of the most traumatic loss that any parent, any sibling, any cousin, any grandparent, anyone can imagine, working with them has been humbling in the face of the grace that they've shown. Their commitment to ensuring that no one else has to go through what they did is inspiring. There are so many I can point to that have made a difference in their own way. They've all sort of focused on different aspects of what we should be doing. And I just wanted to take a moment today to recognize one individual, Max Schachter. I know many of you have gotten to know him here. And this man works tirelessly. He lost his son Alex on that day. But his commitment has actually produced significant progress, thanks to his leadership. And I must say his leadership, and I spoke to him again last Friday, and he continues to work on these issues. And thanks to that, last year the federal government created a federal clearinghouse on school safety best practices, a place that any district, any school can go to, and something that's constantly being updated that puts in a central location the best practices and offers access to an array of resources for schools across our nation that are looking to protect their students. And this is important because in the aftermath of this, everyone was trying to figure out, well, what should we do? And there was no central place where you could go to and find that out. And recently, as my colleague from Florida just pointed out, I, along with my colleague from Florida and Senator Ron Johnson, we reintroduced the Luke and Alex School Safety Act, named partially after his son Max, which would make this clearinghouse permanent. It was put in place by the agency, but this would make it permanent. And I just think of parents like Max who've poured so much of their own lives into this work and continue to do so, and he's